Hey, welcome back to Barry T's Garage. Now it's time to do the Series 2 of the Ford Flathead V8. So we're going to cover 1938 to 1948. That's Series 2. And we'll try to get into the 1949 to 1953. And maybe a little spice, a little Mercury spice thrown in there. And Steve Coppock is our expert. He's got the parts to show us, but he also has the expertise and the study that he's done to share all these fine details that many of us will miss. So thank you for joining us. Okay, Steve, we're back for the next round.
Hey, welcome back, Barry. Always good to see you.
So good to see you again. You know, we left a cliffhanger here. We only did Series 1. Let's talk about the next part of the Flathead story.
Oh, thanks, Barry. Yes, there is a lot to tell. And as we talked about last time, we'll tell it the best I know.
Yep.
And I hope to get most of it correct for you, but I got a lot of examples of things we can look at today to try to tell that story of the Flathead, like you said, from 1938 to 1948. This is the 32 motor that we talked about last time, so I'm not really going backwards, but if there's an important thing I want to point out, because as Ford was transitioning away from the 21 stud design to the second generation, which I call the 24 stud version, the second generation or second series. There was some other things going on within the Ford Motor Company. One was they were creating the Mercury division of Ford during that time frame. The first year for Mercury was 1939. So the 24 stud motor became available in 1938. Ford was also using the Flathead in not just passenger cars, but trucks, like commercial sized trucks, bigger trucks. And there was a need for more power. And what that means is a bigger motor. And the first generation motors had some limitations because of the cylinder head fastening design that I want to point out here real quick, and then we'll transition into that second generation.
Great.
The 21 stud, and I think in our last video we talked about an easy way to identify one, is that there are 5 studs along the very bottom row that hold the cylinder head on. This is the same motor, I've just taken the head off. But one of the limitations you can see really quick here is with this design, there is a stud at the bottom of every cylinder. This one just happens to be removed.
Yeah.
And so what that does is it leaves very little room between the bore and the stud. There's just maybe 1/8 of an inch of space there. This motor has been bored 60 thousandths. But you can see that to get a head gasket that has enough fire ring there between the cylinder and the stud, you would be limited to how big the bore could be before you would just run out of the ability to make a head gasket for that design.
That's right.
So Ford transitioned away from the 21 stud design to a 24 stud design. And that's where I think we need to transition into discussing about 38 and beyond motors, because that's where the 24 stud design started.
Excellent. Perfect. That's a great setup for us.
I'm going to come over here to this table.
Yeah.
And I'm not really skipping ahead, but it's a good way to look at this particular difference we're talking about. This block is representative of 38, 39, 40 motor. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But you can see on this lower set of bolts where the studs for the heads would go, we no longer have that big of a problem that we had before. We got a lot more material here in the block to where the bore can physically get bigger and still be able to put a head gasket on and seal up the design. So this was an important transition. And I don't think there was a problem necessarily with 21 studs being enough bolts or studs to hold the head down and seal just fine. I think it was a real limitation that Ford ran into with the 21 stud design, with being able to make a bigger motor.
Yeah, they wanted more displacement.
Needed more displacement for a couple of reasons, and the Mercury being one of them. Maybe while we're here, we'll go ahead and talk about, I said it was representative of 38, 39, and 40 block. There are some differences that make a 38 different than 39 or 40, but externally they look the same.
Okay.
The blocks look the same.
Okay.
One difference, again, if you're in a swap meet or you're at a museum or wherever and you see, and you're not quite sure, one of the differences between 38, 39, and 40 is the length of the crankshaft. And you can look at, I call it the snout of the crankshaft, and see that difference if you know what you're looking for.
Okay.
So if I can, I like to point out that difference. So this is a much earlier motor. I think in the last video we said it was either a 33 or 34, but the length of the crankshaft is the same for the 38. I call it short.
Yeah.
The 38 still had this shorter crankshaft. And so when you're looking at a motor, if it has this really short crankshaft, and even with the pulley being on it, the pulley is just right up against the front of the motor, and then there's a bolt or sometimes a hand crank bolt in there that you can see it's very short compared to this motor right here, which is either a 39 or 40. And we can tell that by looking at this crankshaft snout. Of course, this is the pulley, but this is the bolt or nut that holds this pulley on, which is much farther forward.
Yep.
And then maybe even the one sitting right next to it.
Yeah, you can easily see the difference.
Yeah, so that's an earlier motor, but the 38 still had the short crankshaft in it. So another thing that you can look at, since we're here, we'll talk about it. In 39 and 40, even though externally they looked similar to the 38, 39 and 40 cars and 41 pickups drove the fan right off the front of the crankshaft.
Right.
Earlier ones ran, like the 32 behind you, the fan ran right off the end of the generator.
Right.
So that was a change. And here's an example of a 3940 fan right here. And it would have bolted, right on to there.
Yeah.
So as you can see, the radiator design in 3940 much different than the earlier ones.
Yeah, the fan is mounted way lower.
Yeah, so the radiator sits further into the chassis. That's if you again see that pulley, doesn't necessarily mean the block is a 39 or 40, but you have a clue that it's likely came out of a vehicle that was either a 39 or 40.
Okay.
38 would look the same, just would have the shorter snout in the front. We'll go back over to the table since we were talking. Yeah. Some other ways to tell 38, 39, 40 motors is on the side of the block. See these little bumps here?
Yep.
That's the same as the first generation motors.
Okay.
They had this bump here also. And what that's for, there are some casting core plugs in the oil pan rail. Okay. That are, some people, I think, mistakenly call those freeze plugs. Because the oil pan's on there, if it got cold, there's no way that those plugs will push out. Right. But I think more accurately, they're there for the casting process. So there's plugs in there that look a lot like freeze plugs. But you can easily tell by these little bumps on the side that this is either a 38, 39, or 40 motor because of those bumps. And we'll talk about 41 and 2 and beyond in a minute. But they are not on the 41.
Okay, but you will see them all the way from 32 to 40.
That's correct.
Bumps.
That's correct.
Okay.
So even the 32 motor over there has those same bumps on the side of the block. A couple of other clues. When you're looking at these earlier blocks, there's a shelf right here. I call it a shelf. Right here above where the timing cover would bolt down. And some people like to run what they call the pencil test. Okay. Which is not a perfect, I prefer to do it visually. Yeah. But the pencil test would imply that you could rest a pencil right across here. Okay. And it would balance up to 1942, actually. There's that shelf there. Okay. After that, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, that is eliminated altogether.
So, but anyway, you can take the idea that at least it's the width of a pencil where there's this ledge.
That's right. That's right.
So
that's another visual clue. So the bumps on the side and this shelf are indicative of motors that were made pre-war, before World War II, before the United States entered into World War II. Yeah. Another thing I'd like to point out, and this is actually a block, an example. I guess before I go there, you need to ignore this. This is an example of a block relief, but this is not something that came from Ford. Ford did have a relief in some of the later blocks, but this is something a hot rodder has done to this block at some point in the past. But the point, I guess, is if you look closely, there's a sleeve, a separate piece, a sleeve that fits down inside this cylinder.
Yeah.
And these are factory Ford sleeves. A lot of these earlier motors, 38 to 48, came with these sleeves installed from the factory.
No kidding.
And they were intended to be field replaceable, meaning you could replace them actually with the engine still in the car. There were special tools made. They're very thin, about 40 thousandths of an inch thick. Yeah, so they were made to be removed, and you can either put sleeves back in it and put standard size pistons and rings in, or you could remove them all together, bore the block, and put oversized pistons and rings in at that point.
Cool.
And that's what happened to most of them. Most of them, the idea of replacing the sleeves, they did it, of course. So, but it's an example of one, and if you see one around, that's what that is.
Yeah.
A very thin sleeve. Of course, there can be thicker sleeves that are installed, of course.
Can you tell me how the cubic inch displacement changed over this time?
Yes, it's a really good question, Barry. The Fords of this era were 221 cubic inches, just like the 32 motor started at 221 cubic inches. 3 1/16 bore, 3 3/4 inch stroke. We mentioned earlier about the Mercury coming out in 1939. So 1939 Mercury blocks, although they look externally the same, came with a 3 3/16 bore.
Okay.
So an 1/8 of an inch bigger bore than the Ford motors, and they were 239 cubic inches versus 221. 221. One thing people probably have heard of the 4-inch Mercury crank, and we'll talk more about that later. But in these earlier years of Mercury, they had the same stroke, but just a bigger bore.
Okay.
To go from 220.
It's the only thing that changed.
200, yeah. And so that we talked earlier about the 24 stud design allowed a bigger bore. That was the Mercury's then in 39 came out with the 239 cubic inch motor.
Yeah.
Which would not have been possible with the 21 stud design.
Right. So one shortcut thing is if it's a 21 stud, it's not a Mercury.
That's true. That is true. So another difference, Ford at this point, if you remember, 32 was 65 horse, then went to 75 horse, eventually 85 horse. These early 24 studs are still 85 horsepower. The Mercury with the 239 cubic inches is 10 horsepower more, or 95 horsepower.
Okay.
And that was primarily from the bigger bore, more displacement.
Yeah.
So the next sort of iteration of this Generation 2 or Series 2 Flathead, still 24 studs, but some changes were made in 1941 and 1942. We talked about 38, 39, and 40. So this is an example of a 41 or a 42 Flathead block. So this is important time in U.S. history as well. You know, the United States entered the Second World War in December of 41. February of 1942, all domestic car production was essentially stopped. So 41 and 42, pre-war, is you'll hear that term a lot with the Flatheads, examples of pre-war. We'll talk in a minute about this one, which is an example of the Series 2 or Generation 2 that's post-war.
Okay.
So let's we'll work on some differences here for the 41 and 42. One of the first things that you can look for to know it's a 41 or 2 is those bumps on the side of the block that we talked about earlier for those core plugs are no longer there.
Right.
And it's not just the bumps. If you were to take the pan off, the core plugs are not there at all. So it's a solid pan rail underneath. Another interesting thing is this intake surface. A lot of people say it's raised, and it certainly looks raised, but it's at the same height. There's just less casting material around the surface where the intake manifold bolts on. And I'm only guessing that less cast iron might have been the reason why they did that. I really don't know.
Right.
But it's a clear indicator that it's a 41 or 42 motor because you can see it from a mile away.
Yeah.
Still has that flat surface we talked about up front, like we talked about the pencil test.
Yeah, it's still
no
there.
difference there. The Ford's still 221 cubic inches. Mercury's are still 239. But horsepower is up just a little bit to 90 horsepower for the Fords. And we crested to 100 horsepower for the Mercuries for the first time with the 41. And then later the 42 engines, which weren't made for very long. This is an example of a post-war Flathead. The war, the United States involvement in the war ended summer of 1945. Domestic car production started up again in 1946. So the first year for this motor style of Flathead was 1946. They made this 46, 47, and 48, so 3 years before transition to what we're calling the third series or third generation. So some things to point out here. Ford and Mercury got the same displacement, so 239 cubic inches became the standard in 1946 with this engine. We talked about the shelf on the front of where the timing cover bolts down, the pencil test. The 46, 7, and 8 motors don't have that, and even if you don't have a pencil, I think you can see there's really no shelf there anymore.
Right.
Probably the easiest way to tell, though, is back on the bell housing. There is a number 59 cast into the bell housings, and sometimes you'll see 59, A, 59L, 59Y, but anything with the 59 is an example of the 46, 7, and 8 motor.
Okay.
Another quick way, if the heads are off, is these two round center water passages. And I don't know if you can look right behind us here.
Yeah.
The 41 and 42, I think they call these trapezoid shapes there. So the 59 cast into the bell housing, the two round holes, which carried over to the 8BA, but again, with the longer bell housing, 59. No shelf on the front. And the standard bore for these is 3 3/16, like the earlier Mercury motors we talked about. Still 3 3/4 inch stroke, so no change there. This one has been relieved, similar to the block we saw over there.
So we keep mentioning these reliefs, and it happens a lot. And so even though we are pointing out that wasn't factory, that it was a smooth across the top there between the valves and the cylinder, we want to take just a second to explain why people keep cutting those relief cuts in there.
Yeah, that's a good, I tried to find a block with a factory relief in it, and I did find a few of them, but they're kind of buried and difficult to get. But I can send you a picture of what the factory relief looked like.
Okay.
Ford did the factory relief, as I understand, for 2 reasons. One, to reduce compression a little bit in trucks. Trucks, again, heavy weight, detonation, fuel at the time, gasoline wasn't all that good. So spark knock or detonation is a real problem with the internal combustion engine. So the relief, removing material between the cylinder and the valves, lowered the compression a little bit, not much. As I read or understand, it also was done to try to eliminate some cracking. So it's more like a stress relief for the block between the exhaust valves and the cylinder, which is a pretty common place for a flathead to develop a crack. So those were from the factory. They weren't really done to increase performance or airflow. They were there to reduce compression a little bit and eliminate maybe some of the potential for cracking. So
is less area relieved then than what we see with the hot rodders?
Yeah, they're straight across. They're not flared out like that. They're straight across. They're done. It looks like they were done with a grinding wheel. I don't know how they did them at the factory, but when you look at them, they're not smooth like this. It almost looks like a big grinding wheel, and it's uniform width across and about 80 thousandths thick. It's not very pretty,
right?
But I think it probably served the purpose that Ford intended. But what hot rodders are always looking for, right, is more power. And so the reason these are shaped the way they are is to try to improve the flow out of the cylinder into the exhaust, which is here, and from the intake into the cylinder here. So this flared out gets it closer to the diameter of the valve. And it's a bit of a trade-off. You can't go too deep. You get into the water passage.
Right.
You're also lowering compression at the same time. So while you might improve flow, you can't get it so big or deep that you hit water. But it's proven to improve flow if done, I don't want to say correctly, because everybody has their own idea of what correctly is. But there's definitely ways to improve flow on a flathead engine, intake and exhaust flow, with the relief between the bore and the valve area.
Okay. Well, we're going to cover that kind of detail more later when we get into a performance flathead story.
That'll be fun. That'll be fun.
But thanks for at least, I thought in this video we should at least cover the general idea here. So we know what we're talking
since we had two examples of where somebody had done them.
Rather than just ignore it completely, right?
That's right.
Okay, good. So this covers the 46, 47, 48. All right, Steve, we're here at Series 3 and the 8BA. What can you tell me about this particular engine series?
Yeah, Barry, this is, I'd say, the last, at least in my opinion, of the generations of flathead engines. As you mentioned, 8BA is what I call it. That's really the Ford version. Mercury version 8CM, some call it, or just Mercury block. But I'm going to call it an 8BA block. They made these from 1949 to 1953, and there really weren't too many changes across those years, so not as much to talk about on this motor, but there are definitely some differences between Series 3 and Series 2 that we can talk about.
Okay.
One of the easiest things to recognize is there no longer is a cast-in bell housing on the back of the motor.
Right.
We talked about, we pointed out to it a couple times that the number 1 and number 2 series blocks have a cast-in bell housing, at least the top half, with the bottom half being made up by the oil pan.
Yeah.
So the 8BA, none of the 8BA blocks have that cast-in bell housing.
Yep.
And while we don't have a timing cover on the front of this one, Ford made a big change and took the distributor from the very front of the motor, mounted down low, to angled up towards the tops, more conventional, more like people are familiar with the small block Chevy or small block Ford or Mopars. Some are in the front, some in the back, but the distributor up where you can actually see it and work on it.
Believe it or not, there's one right behind you on that red block back there.
Yeah, that's a great example right behind us. The timing cover and the distributor angled up towards the right side of the motor.
Yeah.
Yep, that's a good example.
Okay.
Which made them way easier to work on. Set the timing, adjust the points, change the points condenser, change spark plug wires. That distributor being in the front down low, very difficult to work on with the engine in the car and the fan and fan belts and all that stuff in the way. Very difficult.
Right.
So 8BA, all of the 8BA Ford motors were 239 cubic inches.
Okay.
The same displacement we had with the 59 series Generation 2 blocks, the post-war 59 series blocks. But one interesting thing about the Gen 3 motors is the Mercury blocks had the same bore as the Ford blocks, but they had a longer stroke crank. So they had a 4-inch stroke crank instead of a 3 3/4-inch stroke crank. Same bore as the Ford, but longer stroke, which made them 255 cubic inches for the Mercuries.
Okay.
And maybe in a minute we'll talk a little bit about the crankshafts. And of course, if you can pick up a 1/4-inch stroke crank and put it in a different motor, or even have a Mercury motor to run, hot rodders love those 4-inch Mercury stroke cranks. Yep. And they still do. So this particular example is not a great one. This particular motor has had a rough life. Someone in the past tried to weld right here where I'd say the typical cracks are in flatheads, right across between the bolts. It looks like they did a decent job welding it, and probably could work. Okay. Around on the other side of the motor, though, there's been some cracks up in the exhaust ports that don't look very encouraging to me. Right. And then the deck of the block has some pitting in it. So this is not a great example of an 8BA usable block, but it is a good example of what an 8BA
you can see what it
motor looks like. Yep.
Yeah.
We talked about the bell housing not being cast in, but I'd like to show you what they do look like. So Barry, this is an example of an 8BA bell housing. This one happens to be stamped steel and it happens to be chromed. Somebody chromed it along the way.
Okay.
Some of these are cast iron and some of them are stamped steel. The cast iron ones tended to be on the trucks, and the passenger cars tended to get the stamped steel, but that's not an absolute either. But they all look pretty much the same. So this would just bolt to the back of the block and be the bell housing. The advantage of these is, unlike the Gen 1 and Gen 2 or Series 1 and 2 motors, the oil pan can stay on the motor and you can change the clutch and the flywheel out.
Okay.
The oil pan on the 8BA blocks stops at the back of the engine.
Okay.
So it doesn't wrap around the flywheel.
All right. But that does bolt partly to the oil pan?
No, it doesn't.
Okay.
But what it does do is, this is called the starter plate.
Okay.
In the earlier motors, the oil pan was the starter plate. It has tapped holes in it and the starter bolted right to the oil pan.
Yep.
But for the 8BA block, since the oil pan stops at the back of the motor, then this is the starter plate that just bolts on
Oh, I see.
like this.
Yeah.
So these lower bolts really just hold the starter plate on. They don't bolt to the oil pan.
I see.
But then the starter bolts on, same basic starter, same bolt configuration as the earlier engines, just it mounts in a different fashion to the motor.
One advantage, or maybe one reason Ford did this, was so they could mount a lot of different transmissions, like for trucks and so on, to the back.
Well, that's possibly true. It is interesting though that when you look at the back, if this was bolted on to the back of an 8BA motor, this bolt pattern is the same bolt pattern as the Gen 1 and Gen 2 motors.
Okay.
So I don't know if that's true or not, but
Okay.
I do know the standard bolt pattern is the same.
Okay.
Now it is true that they did use, Ford and Mercury used different transmissions than the early Fords did.
Okay.
And in fact, some of these actually had automatic transmissions that bolted to the back of them. Different setup, quite a bit different setup, but yeah, automatics.
So automatics were factory bolted to the back of Flatheads. Yeah, I guess that's right.
That's
53 Mercury comes to mind.
I have a few automatic transmission pieces over here, and actually at home I do have a Ford automatic, actually Mercury automatic transmission. Same transmission, I think, but it came out of a Mercury car.
Yeah, yeah. It seems like the 8BA is the most commonly sought after. Are there any other reasons why people did?
If you think about it, from 32 to early 50s, we're talking about 20 years roughly of flathead design improvement, lessons learned, evolution of the design. And the 49 to 53s got the best of all, got the benefit of all of that information. So whether you're talking about cooling, whether you're talking about valve train, the pistons, rods, I would say just a better overall engine from a reliability standpoint. So I think people tend to gravitate toward them sort of from that way. They do have a different look, and one thing we didn't talk about yet is that about the water passage. I want to tell you about that.
Okay.
Water outlets, but they look different. They're not the same look as the Gen 1 and 2 motors. So there are people that prefer the older engines. We talked about the 21 studs, and there's vintage racing folks that love the 21 studs. In fact, can't use a newer engine sometimes. So if you like that center outlet of the head look, whether it's 21 stud or 24 stud, you're going to want one of the earlier engines. Yeah. If that's not important to you, and to some it's not, then the 49 to 53, the 8BA, is kind of where people tend to seek out a flathead for their project. Okay. In my opinion, personal opinion, the post-war 59 24 studs is like my go-to and a lot of people's go-to. Okay. And the 8BA as well. Okay. The earlier engines, in my personal opinion, are better suited for restoration or potentially vintage racing
Yeah.
applications.
Something that has to be more authentic to the time,
Yeah.
I guess.
So these are, in my opinion, excellent platforms to build a flathead on. So somebody, if the look is not that important, wants to get into working on a flathead, this would be what my recommendation would be.
Okay.
Try to start with an 8BA. Maybe a couple other things to point out, Barry, that I've managed to forget. But we talked about 1936 being the first year that Ford had insert style bearings for the main bearings. 1949, Ford introduced insert style bearings on the connecting rods.
Okay.
Up until 1949, so 32 to 48, they were those full floating bearings that we talked about in one of the earlier series that look sort of like this. Some have flanges, some don't. But, and if you remember, these rotate inside the rod as well as rotate on the crank.
Right.
But in 49 through 53, much more, by today's standards, conventional rod with the little inserts for the tangs of the rod bearings to fit in, so that they only turn on the crank, not inside the rod.
Right.
So that's an important difference, 49 and 53.
Okay.
This is an aluminum head, and just using it for an example. But you can see pretty quickly that the water outlets on these heads are at the front of the motor. This happens to be the front. You can't tell because it's not on the block, but this is the front, whereas all the Series 1 and 2 motors, the water outlet is in the middle of the head.
Okay.
So another quick way to identify an 8BA style engine is to look for where the water outlet is.
Okay, and what about the water pump location?
Oh yeah, the water pump is in the same location as the 37 and newer motors.
Okay.
There is a slight difference between the 8BA water pumps and the either mounted on the front. In fact, they have the same bolt pattern, but this little hole right here is a water passage that the earlier motors don't have. So if you're looking at water pumps, the 8BAs have a little bit of a difference in the casting to accommodate that. Both of these water inlets.
Okay, now you're teasing us with these crankshafts back here.
Let's look at this. We mentioned the 4-inch stroke that the Mercury cranks had, or Mercury engines had, and I have an example of one of those right here. Actually, I got a couple of examples. Maybe first I'll show you this crankshaft, which is out of an earlier engine.
Yeah.
One of the engines with the full floating rod bearings.
Okay.
You can identify those pretty quick because there's only one oil hole for each rod throw.
Okay.
And that's because the bearing overlapped that entire hole. Still had 2 rods, and there's holes in the bearings for oil to come up through there, but if you look at the rod throw, it only has 1 oil hole.
That's on the
This is a main bearing, and it only has 1, but the rod throw, so this one and this one, that one, only have 1 hole. So when they went to the insert style, more modern bearing in 49, the cranks now have two holes on each rod throw, 1 for each rod. If you're looking at a pile of crankshafts in the scrapyard or swap meet, and you look pretty quickly, you can tell if it's an earlier crank with the 1 hole or a 49 to 53 crank with the 2 oiling holes in each rod.
Okay, that was 49 that started.
49 to 53, yep.
So that's a pretty big difference on the 8BA from the others.
So much more, if you think about insert bearings both in the mains and in the rods, so that's the way cars are built today. I mean, that design is still pretty much universal even today. So big improvement in design, in my opinion. Although Ford made millions of these with these full floating rod bearings, I'm not trying to say it wasn't a good design, but certainly more, in my opinion, serviceable, easier to work on with these insert style bearings.
Right. Okay.
So now the question, becomes, well, how do you know if you have a Mercury 4-inch crank or whether you have a Ford 3 3/4-inch 8BA crank?
And that could be an important question.
It is important. The Ford cranks aren't worth very much. The 3 3/4-inch stroke cranks, if you find one, they're, I don't know, $100 or less probably.
Yeah.
Whereas the Mercury cranks with the 1/4 inch longer stroke, people pay several $100, $500-600, and you can actually buy new ones today.
Really?
From Scat and Eagle.
Mm-hmm.
They're $800-900 a piece. So the longer stroke is still desirable. So I wanted to demonstrate that real quick.
Yeah.
So one of the ways to look is, I'm going to turn this over just a little bit, is this, it's actually called a clean out plug.
Okay.
If we were to take that out, the inside of this rod journal is hollow. And it tended, as the crank spun, it would tend to accumulate debris sort of in that chamber.
Okay.
And when you needed to replace the crank or have it turned or whatever, what you would do is take these plugs out and clean that all out.
Okay.
Someone, these are normally pressed in, someone at some point has tapped and threaded this hole for a pipe plug.
Okay.
But the difference is the relative size of this hole. This is a Ford crank compared to this Mercury crank here. So you can pretty well visually see how much bigger that hole is compared to that hole.
Yeah.
So that's one sort of telltale sign that you have a Mercury crank, is the size of this hole, which is 5/8 of an inch.
Okay.
I happened to bring, I pulled actually this one out so we could see it, but that's what it looks like. And getting them out is sometimes difficult.
Yeah.
So this was a tool I made. It's just a bolt, 1/2 inch threaded bolt, and this is the same thread as my slide hammer.
Okay.
So I use my 1/2 inch tap, and I try to tap a few threads into this plug, thread this in here, and then use my slide hammer, and they pop right out.
You pop it out, yeah.
So, but I think people watching would say, Steve, sometimes there are no plugs, and I've seen that to be true, especially on the Ford version. I don't know that I've seen a Mercury version without the plug.
Okay.
Or the 5/8 diameter. But another way to check, well, one is you could measure the stroke. You could put the crank on a fixture.
Yep.
And I use a piece of plywood with some V's cut in it, mounted on a 2x4, put the crank in there and use a dial indicator and just measure it.
Yeah.
That's a surefire way. But usually if you're in the swap meet or scrapyard,
might not be able to do
probably
that.
don't have that.
Yeah.
So looking for these plug size is important. But another way that's pretty easy to check is the size of these counterweights. These front not the very front, but these counterweights, these big thick ones.
Yeah.
And I have my tape measure here behind me. So this again is the Ford crank, and if you measure right across, there's flat here and flat here, and measure across there, you can see it's roughly 5.5 inches. Whereas if you do the same measurement on the Mercury crank, it's about 6.25 inches.
Obviously different. Yeah.
So if you're, again, you can usually take these with you to the junkyard, or if you're on Facebook Marketplace and you're just trying to verify that it's a 4-inch crank, look at the size of those plugs and then measure across the counterweight. And maybe that's not a 100% guarantee, but I've never found it to let me down if I make those measurements.
That's really good.
Hey, Barry, something I wanted to show you on this crank, and it bleeds over into maybe some of the high performance stuff I'd like to talk about someday with you.
Okay.
Is if you remember when we were talking about connecting rods, Gen 1, this is an example of 32 to 38 Ford connecting rod. It's a little bit spindly looking, but it's set up for all of those early engines.
Okay.
Had a 2-inch diameter rod journal.
Okay. So
the postwar 59 series blocks had a 2.138, so a little bit bigger than 2 and an eighth.
Okay.
And this is still full floating, but a bigger diameter rod journal. The 8BAs maintained that 2.138 inch journal, even though they went to the insert style bearings. So another hot rodder trick that people used, in fact it's been done to this crank, is they'll take the 4-inch Mercury crank 2.138 journal. They'll what's called offset grind it, so it's not ground perfectly round anymore. It's offset to one direction. You can offset ground it 1/8 of an inch, another 1/8 of an inch. So instead of a 4-inch, you can change it to a 4 1/8 inch stroke.
Right.
But now it has a 2-inch rod journal. So they took the earlier 2-inch full floating rods, which was either the real early design or pre-war Gen 2 blocks, all had the 2-inch rod journals. And they would use the 2-inch full floating rods on the 4 1/8 inch Mercury crank, and all with Ford parts except for the pistons. They had to have custom pistons made. But a lot of hot rodders in the early days, Bonneville, Salt Flat, drag race guys, made a 4 1/8 inch stroke
that way.
Yeah,
and one thing I want just for clarification, an offset grind, you still end up round. It's just that the center line gets moved over.
That's right.
And all the bulk of it takes off one side and the other side gets nothing.
That's a good clarification. Yeah, you take the meat off of one side to increase the stroke. And the other side gets a little bit, not much. But you end up with the stroke being offset, like you said, 1/8 of an inch. You can do the same modification to the Ford 3 3/4 inch crank, but you end up with a 3 7/8 inch stroke, which is not nearly as much fun to brag about as the 4 1/8 inch stroke.
That's right. Very good. Well, that's really nice that we could see them, not just talk about them, but see these different crankshafts and how they're set up. Okay, so what else can you tell me about the 8BA system?
Well, the last thing that's on my mind, and I'm sure there's other things I've missed, but a big change was made in the valve train. We talked in the Series 1 video that Ford used this tulip-shaped valve. I call it tulip on this end. I guess both ends technically are tulip-shaped. With the two-piece valve guides. For the 8BA blocks, they went to what I would consider a more traditional, by today's standards, valve design. Whereas the valve had a straight stem, one-piece valve guide, a more traditional retainer and keepers. These are, I'd say, this is an aftermarket stainless steel valve that maybe we'll talk about someday. But the 8BA valve looks very similar to that. It just wouldn't have that undercut stem right there. So this made, in my opinion, the engines much more serviceable, better to work on, easier to work on. You still had to grind the tip of the valve to set the lash, so that never changed, the whole design. But a pretty important change that was made with the 8BA style blocks.
So Series 1 and Series 2 then all had that same valve.
At this, not much difference if you were to pull the valve out of that 32 motor or a valve out of even a post-war 59 AB block, it would look like this. So the 8BA, the 49 to 53s went to this, by today's standards, more typical valve design.
Interesting. Well, that for someone like me, that would make a good vote for the 8BA.
They're easier to get apart. They're still a pain, but they're way easier to get apart than these, in my opinion.
Very good. Well, Steve, I think that wraps up our Series 2 and 3, or our Series 3 video. I'm just to tease people, we are going to make another video, so if you want to look for it, it's going to include some of these shiny and exciting wild parts here that still apply to the Ford Flathead. And so we'll be making a video, right, Steve? You're going to do that?
Yeah, I'd love to. What I enjoy the most about the Flatheads is seeing what they're capable of, right? And so we've talked mostly about stock parts and the differences from year to year. What I'd like to spend some time talking about is just what you can do. What can you do with the valve train? What can you do with the rods and pistons? We talked a little bit about the crank. Superchargers is a great way to improve the Flathead because it helps them breathe a lot better, and that's the biggest problem they have. So we're going to talk about the Arden and some of the history of the Arden, heads, which is what that is, and right behind it with the yellow and blue covers is an Arden prepared block. So it has some very unique differences that we're going to be able to talk about. And then we'll get into some of the supercharger stuff. And then hopefully we'll go to the dynamometer here in a month or two and see what we can do with one of these.
That would be exciting. That would be very good. Well, Steve, we'll be looking for the next video too. Thanks for helping us go through all these details.
Thanks for coming by, Barry.
Right
See you
on.
next time.
All righty. Thanks for joining me and Steve talking about these Series 2 Flatheads. And I hope you'll join us for the next one. And also thank you for your comments, for following along with us, for your subscriptions. All those things mean a lot to us. Thanks for helping grow our channel. And I look forward to seeing you on the next one.